Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to our hybrid panel today on the role of trade in the EU's Fit for 55 package. I'm Shada Islam. I'm an independent analyst and commentator based here in Brussels. Now, we all know that trade has a very important role to play in strategies to mitigate climate change, but many questions persist. Can trade really provide a solution, or is it part of the problem? Does it make sense to import products from outside? A question that's often asked here in Europe. Can the EU act alone on climate change, or does it need global alliances and global partners? Is it enough for the EU to be acting alone on the Green Deal? So many questions that we're going to talk about, discuss, and explore over the next hour. We have with us, of course, starting off, we have Dr. Peter Havlik. He's a research leader at IASA, that's the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, is an independent international research institute with national member organizations in Africa, the Americas, Asia, and of course here in Europe. Then we have a Q&A debate with the Canadian representative to the EU, Judith Gelbman. She works at the Canadian Mission on Agricultural Issues. And joining me here on stage is John Clark. He's Director for International Relations at DG Agri. John is going to be here as well, commenting and engaging in a conversation with Judy. And then we'll move on to a debate with another person who's here with me on stage, is Marcel van der Vliet. He's president of CELCA, which is the European Liaison Committee for Agriculture and Agri-Food Trade. And you will be speaking on behalf of agri-traders in the European Union. Joining us online will be Angus Woods, an Irish farmer who's active in the production of beef, lamb, and cereals, and he'll be speaking on behalf of the farming community. Angus, thank you very much for joining us online as well. Now, this is going to be an interactive session, so please do bring your comments and your questions. Make your questions small and precise and quite succinct, and I will try and put them to the panel online and also to these wonderful gentlemen joining me on stage here in Brussels. So as I said, it's hashtag AgriOutlook on slido.com, so please do interact with us. Now, I'm going to turn to Dr. Peter Havlik for his PowerPoint presentation on the EU's role as a mitigator on climate change and the impact this can or cannot have on the rest of the world. So, Dr. Peter Havlik, of course, you've been working for a long time on these issues, and you have published worldwide, and you're, of course, internationally renowned. So we're very pleased to have you here with us for a scene-setting intervention. So I'm going to turn the floor to you now, Dr. Peter Havlik, for 12 minutes to make your presentation. Screen's yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the introduction and for the opportunity to introduce this session by sharing some results of our work. So the work which I will present is a joint work together with my colleague Stefan Frank, and deals indeed about the EU climate mitigation action in the context of international trade. Next slide, please. So just as matter of introduction, but those of you who already participated in the plenary session have heard this or knew it already way before. Indeed, if we want to live up to the ambitious commitments of the Paris Agreement, meaning trying to stabilize climate change well below 2 degrees and aiming at 1.5 degrees, this means that the whole economy needs to reach at the global scale climate neutrality somewhere between 2060 and 2080. Europe took the leading role to be the first continent to announce climate neutrality for already 2050. And in this context, also the climate neutrality of the whole agricultural, forest, and other land use sectors, the AFLU sector, for 2035. So next slide, please. So just as matter of the context, here a few statistics about the greenhouse gas emissions related to agriculture. So Europe represents about 8% of the global direct agricultural emissions. Here I'm talking mostly about the nitrous oxide emissions and methane emissions, the direct emissions from agricultural production. Both at the EU level and globally, livestock is by far the largest contributor to these emissions, with 80% for the overall livestock. At the global scale, beef represents almost 50% of the total GHG emissions from agricultural sector, while in the EU it's a little bit less, at about 30%. On the other hand, in Europe, it is about 38% of emissions coming from the dairy production, while at the global scale, these emissions represent about 24%. Next slide, please. So far, I was showing the total numbers and also mostly focusing on the direct agricultural emissions. An important part of the emissions related to agricultural productions are also emissions from the land use change, from the conversion of forests and other natural vegetation to agricultural land. Here, the numbers show in terms of intensity of emissions of CO2 equivalent per calorie produced in the different products. Again, beef appears as the most important product to consider when we are talking about mitigation in the agricultural sector, followed by other livestock products with moderate intensities of the crop products. Next slide, please. Now, going closer to our topic of the international trade in the climate change mitigation, and for this it appears to us key to consider the differentiated greenhouse gas efficiencies of the production in the different regions. And indeed, there we can identify, for example, looking at the figure showing a percentage of the region in global livestock production and the percentage of the livestock production emissions in the global emissions. How do these regions stand in terms of overall efficiency? So, for example, Europe or European Union sitting on this 1 to 2 line means that in Europe we have about twice as high greenhouse gas efficiency, or half of the greenhouse gas intensity, compared to the world average. Similar situation is, for example, in Northern America, while, for example, in Latin America or Eastern Africa, the greenhouse gas efficiency is substantially above this. Similar would then apply specifically also for the beef sector. Next slide, please. When we are looking into the crops, there a lot of the emissions are coming from the conversion, indeed, of natural vegetation into croplands. And we see a similar pattern in the efficiency. Because of the carbon density of the tropical regions vegetation as compared to the temperate regions, which is about twice as much, and at the same time about half of the yields in tropical regions compared to the regions, temperate regions, we actually have about 4 times more carbon emitted per hectare cleared for the same ton of crop production in the tropics than in the temperate zones. So this will again have substantial implications for the efficiency of the trade or the negative effects. Next slide, please. Here I just prepare a very short overview of the key exports and imports with respect to the European Union, identifying in a qualitative way what are the main trading partners and how likely is this trade influencing the global GHG balance. So on the one hand, I think I would identify in black the kind of climate neutral trade flows, which I think are the imports from the North America and former Soviet Union to Europe because of the similar GHG intensity in these regions. Similar situation would apply for the European maize imports. At the same time, we have several imports which are at a very high risk of deforestation or forest degradation and or are associated with much higher intensity in terms of direct GHG emissions. These are European imports of palm oil, soybeans and soybean cake from South America mostly, but also North America, oil from Southeast Asia, South America, and beef, of which 80% is imported to the EU from South America. On the other hand, European exports also help at the global scale to keep the greenhouse gas balance rather low by substituting domestic production, which would be more GHG intensive. For example, wheat exports into Africa, similar for maize exports and beef exports in these more GHG intensive regions. Now, next slide, please. In this context, indeed, the question arises whether a unilateral European policy cannot lead even to increased global greenhouse gas emissions if it would lead to reduced production in EU, knowing that it could be substituted by relatively more greenhouse gas intensive imports or trade from other regions. Next slide, please. So we have set up a very simple scenario analysis applying a carbon price which would be consistent with a carbon or climate stabilization pathway with 1.5 degree, and have applied always this carbon price at its full level in the European Union and considered different levels of the involvement of the rest of the world, from no action in the rest of the world at all up to full consistent action in the rest of the world. We were lucky that we could use for this analysis three very well established global agricultural economic models, the Capri model, Magnet model, and the Globio model. Next slide, please. So this unilateral action in Europe would lead by 2050 to an annual reduction of about 36% of the direct greenhouse gas emissions from the total agricultural sector, meaning about 155 million tons CO2 equivalent. Again, livestock would contribute 90% of this reduction, and beef on its own, together with dairy, 75%. Next slide, please. Conscious of the time. So this unilateral action, however, would lead indeed to a leakage effect, which was quantified at, on average, 40% across these different models which we used. So this means that the global mitigation would be, instead of 155 million tons CO2 equivalent in the EU, 90 million tons CO2 equivalent globally. Leakage would occur in this case mostly through beef. Remember that Europe is on the one hand importing beef from Latin America and exporting some beef to Africa. So Africa would substitute the lower imports from Europe by increased domestic production, which is much more inefficient than the European production, and also partly by imports from Latin America. And also Europe would increase imports from Latin America, leading to these efficiency losses. But the positive news is that even this unilateral action would lead to substantial decreases of the GHG emissions at the global scale. Next slide, please. However, European farmers would be disadvantaged in this case. And actually, when unilateral action, then across the board, the production in Europe would be going down, and also the value which the farmers would be getting for their product would be going down. This is very different if a consistent global mitigation effort were implemented, when actually Europe, because of its GHG efficiency, would, for example, for beef production, even increase the produce compared to the baseline scenario to substitute some of the major decreases in the rest of the world. This is visualized on the next slide, where we can see a gradual change in both the production of agricultural product and in the emissions across different regions, as the commitment of the rest of the world to the 1.5 degree target is increasing. Where in the dark blue, it's Europe, which is increasing in this scenario, both the production and in this case, it would be even the emissions at the absolute level. Then North America would be able in this scenario to also increase its production and at the same time decrease the emissions, while the middle and low income regions with higher GHG intensities would be actually decreasing production, but much less than the decreases in GHG emissions because of the GHG efficiency gains. To conclude, next slide, please. So in a very stylized global scenario looking at different levels of climate change stabilization, we have identified that international trade is actually a very important mitigation measure because it allows to untap the differences in the GHG efficiencies across the different regions. Of course, this is true only when accompanied with appropriate policies. In another study we have seen, which is seen on the right-hand side, that only international trade liberalization without accompanying measures would actually lead to overall higher greenhouse gas emissions, mostly because of the competitiveness of the high GHG intensity regions. Next slide, please. So to summarize, I think we have find several good news for the European action. One of them is that the action, even if not immediately followed by other countries, would bring about global climate mitigation benefits. We have found that as the commitment of the rest of the world is increasing, this could potentially represent new opportunities for farmers in the EU, but also in Northern America and in other GHG efficient regions. But of course, this would require also accompanying measures to avoid social disaster in some of the low income and middle income countries. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you indeed, Dr. Peter Havlik, for a lot of information, but also making a very strong point that, yes, EU unilateral action would be good, but multilateral action, concerted multilateral action would be even better for climate mitigation through trade. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to move on now. Thank you very much, Peter, for all that information. It really gives us good food for thought for the rest of the conversation. So I'm going to turn to you now, Judy, and from the Canadian mission to the EU. You're the agricultural expert, and you've heard Dr. Peter Havlik there making quite a strong plea for international action, concerted action, saying unilateral action is not going to be enough. So let me turn to you and ask you what Canada is doing in this field related to trade and climate change mitigation. Screen's yours.
Great, thank you so much. I hope you can hear me. I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing the moderator. I don't know if others are, so just if I ask you to repeat yourself.
The technicians can change my, can make sure that she hears me well.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Is
Judy.
Good?
Yes, good, thank you.
Okay. Well, let me start by saying thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here. I apologize. Our ambassador was going to come originally, and I think some of you might have seen her on the agenda, but she had to pull out at the last minute, and she sends her regrets, so I'm here. And hopefully I can answer your questions, and we can have a good conversation. So on your question about what Canada is doing on the environment in particular, so I just want to be really clear up front. The Government of Canada is very much committed to climate action. That's a top priority for our Prime Minister and for the government. And really, climate action is underlying everything we do across the economy. So in terms of, recovering from COVID, for example, there's a plan in place right now for economic recovery that has climate action and environmental sustainability across the board. So one of the things that we've done recently is released a new climate change plan. It's a healthy environment and a healthy economy. This builds on a pan-Canadian climate framework that we had before. Our most recent budget has put out tremendous amounts of funding, billions of dollars, towards green recovery and climate action. And we, going into COP26, we put forward a new target, a much stronger target. It's ambitious, and but reasonable, and it's backed by investments and a concrete plan. So very, very much committed to climate action. And then, there's a couple of things that are part of that plan that are contributing to, specifically with respect to this conversation. We've also announced a Agri environment strategy as well. That includes targets and objectives that I think are very much aligned with the Farm to Fork strategy. So really quite aligned with the EU in terms of priorities and action that we want to take. And the other part of our climate plan is putting a price on carbon. So what we have right now, we have a price on carbon right now, and that's going to be ratcheted up over a period of time so that it hits $170 Canadian a ton by 2030. So that's a very, very important priority for us. It's also, another area where we're working closely with the EU. In terms of agriculture specifically, we have put in a tremendous amount of funds investing into sustainable agriculture technologies. And really, I think that that's the key to everything: innovative technologies, climate smart agriculture, precision farming. I think this is where we're going to, as our previous speaker was talking about, we're going to increase our productivity while reducing emissions at the same time. We're doing a lot of work in partnership with the EU, research work, and also, we had a summit, a leader summit in the summer, and one of the most exciting things that came out of that summit was a joint initiative to dialogue on sustainable agriculture, looking at really specific issues. So we had one workshop a few weeks ago looking at soil health, and we're looking forward to having other initiatives as well, other workshops to look at the issues in depth and look at areas where Canada and the EU can collaborate. So just very quickly turning to trade, I think it's those kinds of investments that are going to help the agriculture sector grow while at the same time reducing emissions. And really what's important is not to stifle innovation, to impose too much red tape or protection. What we really need to do is make sure that there's free flow of trade and an exchange of knowledge, expertise, technologies. Canada has a lot of technology and innovation expertise that we can share. And that the flow of that expertise and technology comes from trade. CETA is a key to the Canada-EU trade relationship. It was a monumental achievement, and it's proven now, after a few years, that it's beneficial for both sides. And really, I think that Canada and the EU share the fundamental view that you can have free and open trade, protect the environment, and act on climate change at the same time. So I think I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Judy, we will indeed come back to you with some follow-up questions, but I want to turn now to John. And in Brussels, the EU seems to be coming up with quite a few initiatives, actually. Judy's talked about what's happening in Canada, and I was just wondering if you can give us a kind of, in a nutshell, what we've done recently at the EU level on the question of trade and climate change mitigation.
Yes, with pleasure.
Please take your microphone, John.
Thank you. Well, I'll be happy to do so. A couple of interesting lessons to be drawn from the presentation by Mr. Havlik. I think one is that the European agricultural sector has a reasonably good environmental performance. We are the only region, major producing region in the world which in the last 30 years has decreased emissions by 10%, but increased production by 60%. So I think that needs to be borne in mind, but of course we can do more and we can do better. And another important lesson from the presentation was that if Europe goes it alone, if Europe is the only region which puts in place more sustainable production methods, reduces its environmental footprint in farming, this will not be enough. There will be leakage to other regions which don't have the same high environmental standards or targets. And that's why this Commission has very consciously and deliberately decided to put both its agricultural policy and its trade policy at the service of environment and climate action through the Green Deal and through the Farm to Fork strategy. And when it comes to putting trade policy at the service of climate and environmental action, I would point out 3 avenues through which we are trying to do that. The first is, of course, through our network of free trade agreements. Europe is a very, very lucrative, attractive market for the rest of the world, and therefore that gives us a lot of leverage when it comes to introducing in our bilateral trade agreements commitments on environment, climate, animal welfare, labour standards, and so on. So our FTAs generally have a fairly robust sustainable development chapter, which includes, for example, binding commitments on both parties to meet their Paris COP21 climate goals, and many, many other commitments in the environment, climate and labour and environment, animal welfare field. And we are reviewing our FTAs now to make those chapters on sustainable development even more robust, even more enforceable. And also in the new FTAs introducing a sustainable food systems chapter so that the parties can put their food systems on a more sustainable path. The overall philosophy here is cooperation and not coercion. The second avenue is autonomous measures. I don't say unilateral measures because the word unilateral has a lot of very negative baggage, but the EU is putting in place a lot of very serious regulatory measures which are not trade-driven, but they will have an impact on trade. Examples being the recently published deforestation regulation, which will prevent the putting on the EU market products associated with deforestation, be they European origin or third country origin. The review of our pesticides legislation, which will extend now to beyond health and safety to the environmental impact of the use of certain pesticides. And thirdly, the planned sustainability labelling initiative, which will be appearing later in this decade, so that products on the EU market can carry a sustainability label, be they imports or domestic products. And the third avenue is through the multilateral cooperation, because as I said, we cannot do this alone. We need to bring our partners on board to achieve the environmental and climate objectives that we have set for ourselves. And through our development cooperation, in particular with Africa, through the follow-up to the UN Food Systems Summit, through our alliances, the green alliances that we're building with Japan, with Canada, with New Zealand. We've recently launched a new phase of collaboration with the United States, which is possible under the Biden administration. So bilaterally and multilaterally, we are cooperating with our partners so that we can all raise our environmental and climate standards together. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, John. So as we see a lot of initiatives, you've talked about 3 avenues, FTAs having stronger and stronger sustainable development goals in them as well, and sort of, working internationally, multilaterally. And I was just wondering, Judy, from Canada's point of view, how are these different initiatives, the Green Deal, the Fork to Farm initiatives, how are they going down? How are they perceived in Canada?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess, I think to sort of draw on what I was saying earlier, the objectives of the Green Deal, the objectives of the Farm to Fork are very ambitious. They're going in the right direction, and we share a lot of the same objectives and the same goals that are set out there. I think, one of the main messages I think to take away from it all is that there's different paths to sustainability. Each country has to do what makes sense for them to achieve climate and environmental results and sustainable results. That's sort of why, in the Paris Agreement, you have nationally determined contributions that makes a lot of sense. So countries come forward with ambitious plans and that makes sense for them, that makes sense for the stakeholders that help achieve these goals while increasing productivity at the same time. And as the first speaker mentioned as well, having that social context as well. You have to look at sustainability from all angles. So, in terms of what the Europeans are doing. I think we have a lot of admiration, I think, for the ambition. And I think what's important, and you know, John was just mentioning this, the alliances is key, because no one area, one region, one country can do this on their own, and that's a clearly recognized principle on the global stage. You know, we have to work together. We all have to be moving in the same direction. Talk about carbon leakage here. We need to make sure that that doesn't happen. But the key really is to keep open the borders, to keep open trade. I think the first speaker was also talking about how trade helps with the efficiencies in terms of you know, of prioritizing where there's you know, energy efficient production or emissions efficient production. So we have to keep those borders open. We have to keep cooperating. I think Canada and the EU have very strong cooperative relationships, and that's really what's key.
Judy, thank you very much. I just want to ask, is Dr. Peter Havlik still online? No, okay, he's not online. But there is a question for you, Judy, that I think is important that you answer now, which is, would Canada implement a carbon tax mechanism similar to what the EU is thinking about? If so, why not? Because you did talk about carbon adjustment at the beginning, didn't you?
Yep. Yeah. So Canada has a very strong carbon pricing plan in place, and we are going to be ratcheting that up. That's clear. We're working really closely with the provinces to make that happen. So yes, for sure, carbon pricing is very important. It's a very important tool in sending the right economic signals to reduce emissions. So that's important to us. It's important also, I think, that there's a global approach to carbon pricing. So we're working very much with partners there. Our Prime Minister led a panel at COP26 on carbon pricing, where President von der Leyen was speaking as well. I think we're very much on the same page there. In terms of the carbon border adjustment mechanism, the EU proposal, you know, we've also said that we'll be looking at you know, what are the options for Canada. We're going to be working with the EU on that, on the technical details. You know, we're looking at it closely. We're talking to officials at the Commission, and we're also talking to our partners in the US. That's a very important trading partner for us. It makes a difference what they do as well. So that's definitely something that's on our to-do list, looking at those for Canada.
Right. I'm sure John will engage with you with great enthusiasm and interest. Dr. Peter Havlik, you're back online, and I do have two questions for you that have come in, and I think it would be quite nice if you can answer them quite succinctly. One question is it better to trade agri-commodities or to transfer technology to improve GHG efficiency? That's one question. And the other one is, food security is often the reason for developing countries to produce dairy for their own, although, of course, the impact on climate is not optimal. How do you manage these two contradictions, if you like? Once again, time is short, so if you could be quite short in your answers. Thank you.
Okay, I think I will try to be very short. So technology transfer, I think, should be the preferred way, because it allows to maintain the social sustainability of the measures. At the same time, I think that the agricultural sector is a little bit specific because it is conditioned by the climate, by the natural conditions. And we have seen, for example, this example about the carbon density of the vegetation in different places of the world. And this purely by transfer of technologies maybe will not be solved. So I think in the end, it would be a mix of the two. And food security and milk, I think, first of all, Also, milk looks intensive in terms of GHG emissions. I think that there is a huge potential for efficiency improvements, especially in the developing world, both on the beef and on the dairy products. And at the same time, of course, we are talking about regions which are still under-consuming by far compared to many other regions. So definitely those should not be the first candidates to cut the levels of production which they need for satisfying their food security.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peter. Thank you for staying online. It's very important that you do, because I think some questions will keep coming in for you as well. John, if I may just turn to you, and you've listened to what Judy has said and what Dr. Havlik has said as well. Going forward, in terms of cooperation with countries on a bilateral, multilateral level, what are the next steps?
Well, the next steps are to move up. Sorry. I'm sorry. The next steps are to move up one gear, I would say, in terms of bilateral cooperation with our partners, or all of our partners. We now have the Paris climate commitments, which we didn't have 10 years ago, and we are putting into all of our bilateral trade agreements and our cooperation platforms commitments to achieve those Paris goals. And the agreement with Canada is a very good example of what we're doing. Judith Geldman mentioned briefly some of the actions that the EU and Canada are taking together to raise the sustainability of our agricultural production, ensure that trade is sustainable, whether it's on methane emissions, soil health, biotechnology, many areas. And we're replicating that cooperation with many other countries around the globe, and in particular in Africa, where, as Peter Havlik said, the productivity is very low. There is enormous potential in Africa for both raising productivity and therefore food security in a very insecure region, while ensuring that the environment and the climate are improved. And so a very large part of our development cooperation with Africa is devoted to sustainable agricultural production in order to allow and help African countries both to be more food secure for their own populations and to meet the ever more stringent standards applied in the EU to their exports.
Thank you very much, John. There are questions coming in, but I am going to turn now to Marcel, who's been sitting here very patiently, and also Angus, who's joining us online. So as I said, Marcel van der Vliet, President of CELCA, European Agri-Food Traders Association, here with me, and Angus Woods, an Irish beef farmer who has been Vice Chair of COPA's Beef Group, among other things, remotely joining us. Thank you very much for being here, Angus, as well. So Marcel, let's start with you first. You've been listening very patiently, attentively also, I have to say. And let's get your comments on the role of trade in climate change mitigation.
Yes, thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here today. I'd like to underline that traders have been focusing on sustainability already for many years, and as mentioned before, they've contributed. Trade is by definition sustainable in my view, in our view, because the basis of trade starts with comparative advantages, climate conditions, agricultural conditions, which lead in some areas to abundant production, and trade balances supply on the one side and the demand in areas of deficit on the other. So trade contributes to sustainability because it finds the best destination and the optimal value for each and every agri-food product, be it a commodity, a raw material, an ingredient, a derivative, or a byproduct. And so this helps to reduce waste, and it adds value to the agri-produce that our farmers produce so proudly. The trading community, as a second point, is also engaged to the Farm to Fork strategy. And one of the things we've done is to engage our membership to sign the Code of Conduct for Responsible Business and Marketing Practices. So that's been a next step and a signal of commitment. Well, So those are the two first reactions
So
on my part.
basically quite committed and already engaging in very sustainable initiatives and activities is what you're saying, Marcel.
Yes, and if you would like to have a few practical examples, for example, the trading community offers both farmers, their producers, the source of product, and their clients, be it distributors, food processors, the industry, food and drink industry. We have to, in order to stay sustainable, we'd like to do returning business. So we have to pay attention to the interests of our suppliers on the one hand and our clients on the other. So unsustainable behavior will be immediately, it leads to a loss of business.
That's right. It's in your own interest to be sustainable. Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Marcel, for those comments. Let me turn now to you, Angus, joining us online. Let's get your views. You've been here for some time, listening attentively also, I hope. So let's get your views on the role of trade and whether you agree with what's been said so far or not.
Certainly. Good afternoon, everybody. Look, it's quite clear we're living and operating in a global trading environment. And it was good to hear the Commissioner this morning talking about, in relation to CAP, talking about fairness and the importance of fairness in it. I would have long held the view that unless within Europe, unless the DG Agri, DG Environment and DG Trade are operating off the one platform, under the one umbrella, it isn't possible to get fairness into the system. We would have seen in the past where agriculture and beef in particular is a defensive interest in European trade negotiations, but it is an offensive position for a lot of the nations looking to do business with us. But what is clear is Dr. Havlik has clearly indicated that European beef production is more sustainable than a lot of what is already coming into Europe. And we can't put European beef farmers at a disadvantage by undermining the marketplace and offering a less environmental product on the European consumer shelves. So it was very refreshing to hear a considerable amount of thought has gone into the carbon leakage. And it is something that really does need to be addressed, thought of, because ultimately the question is about the importance of trade in the Commission's Green Deal. And I firmly believe the long-term success of the Green Deal and the Farm to Fork will be based around the European trade policy and how they formulate it and how they back up what the European Commission for Agriculture and the European Commission for Environment are asking their people to do. So trade absolutely is critically important.
Thank you very much, Angus, for that as well. John, if I could turn to you, and there is a question coming in, which I think is quite interesting and important that you deal with now. So the question is, if EU negotiations with Mercosur and China, don't think you're in trade negotiations with China at the moment, but whatever, if they fail or relations with Russia deteriorate, how will the EU envisage its net zero carbon emissions future through trade?
Well, as I tried to illustrate earlier this afternoon, through our trade agreements, we are in a modest way trying to raise the environmental and climate standards in our partner countries, so that the whole of the whole world are on the same trajectory towards climate neutrality by a given date. But FTAs are not the only solution, and I think trade cannot be the silver bullet at all times, or the panacea, and that's why, outside of the remit of the free trade agreements, we have been putting in place, and we will be putting in place more measures on the European single market to ensure that products being sold in Europe do not have a heavy environmental footprint and have been produced in a sustainable way. And the new work on pesticides that DG Sante is carrying out, looking at the environmental impact of particular pesticides used in production overseas, and the deforestation regulation. These are, I think, very good examples of how we are outside the strict FTA or trade policy area, ensuring that both European production and imports contribute to climate action and not the opposite. So I think we are doing this in a very, very serious, strategic and comprehensive manner. Angus Woods mentioned the question of fairness. I think he has a very, very good point there. And when it comes to the beef sector, we don't liberalise that sector in our free trade agreements because that would cause difficulties for domestic production, which, as we saw from the initial presentation, is relatively sustainable compared to the production in many other countries. And on the question with regards to Mercosur that came up on Slido, I think it's worth recalling that when the Commission did its own sustainable impact assessment on what would be the environmental impact of the Mercosur FTA on Europe, the results were rather minimalistic. The volumes of imports of beef from Mercosur are so low they will not have a very important environmental footprint in the first place. And secondly, the beef that Europe is sourcing from the Mercosur region is not coming from areas which are subject to recent deforestation. So they are very traceable, and so there is not a serious sustainability problem with these admittedly fairly small volumes of South American beef coming in.
Though, of course, often in the headlines. Angus, would you like to come back with a comment to what John has just said about the beef production?
Yeah, I mean, you know, beef production in Europe is largely extensive. It's low input. It's operating on marginal grassland. It really has a good environmental footprint, and it really has a lot to offer. In relation to the free trade agreements, I suppose a lot of the talk is whenever anyone is talking about free trade agreements, it's always talking about the next free trade agreement and where we go from here kind of thing. But I would imagine, I would certainly sense that there is a real reluctance to reopen trade agreements that are already in place that have sustainability standards put in, which given that we're talking about significantly increasing the sustainability standards of European production, the obvious question would be, you know, are we going to go back and reopen those free trade agreements and have a look at how the product coming in would match that? Now, that's obviously going to be very difficult because anyone sitting on the other side of the table would say, well, sure, if we're going to open it up, we're going to be looking for something here ourselves. So it's a difficult scenario for Europe to deal with. But it is something that needs to be borne in mind, because as we raise the standards that we're asking our European farmers to produce too, you know, the question is, what are we asking the imports to do or to match? And, you know, as farmers, we would always say imports coming into Europe should be the same as European production. That's a bottom line for us. They should match up. In reality, there's a thing called the equivalence of standards, and often the questions are asked, you know, how close is equivalent? And these are real areas there. Going back to the original question of how important is trade in relation to our climate ambition, the closeness of those equivalents is vital to that question.
Thank you, Angus. A good point about raising standards within the European Union, which brings me to you as well, Marcel. You talked about sustainability and how you're committed to that, but that comes at a price. And so what is that price and how are you dealing with it?
Well, in today's context of food and agri commodity markets, we see a huge rise in prices already for 4 or 5 months. Everything has been lifting to very high levels, as also published by the Food and Agricultural Organization recently. And there is a substantial price inflation going on. And so it hasn't hit the consumer yet, but I'm afraid it will definitely happen in the first quarters of the next year. So a free flow of goods, and trade is contributing to offset all those price increases. Agricultural markets are subject to weather changes, but there's a lot of geopolitics involved as well today. So we have been always pleading to prevent collateral damage for the food and agri sectors. And so I think trade can help to offset those inflationary pressures. Sustainability comes at a price. If you think of emissions trading schemes and the compensation, there's tools that traders can offer their clients if they want to offset their CO2 footprint. There are market-conforming instruments for that, but they come at a price, and the price is going up rather rapidly. So we have to keep this in mind. Who is going to pay for that in the end? And in my personal experience and the trading community that I'm active in, they have difficulty to pass on this price. There's other elements that I was thinking of in terms of traders help to optimize the logistical steps that are needed to put the product at the right place. So they offer the whole range of solutions. For example, intermodal transport options to reduce the number of trucks on the road. There's more and more intermodal logistical solutions, which we are actively using and encouraging our customers to optimize their logistics. So more trade also enables more efficient routing of products. And this, I think, together with the logistical sector and the transport sector, we can make huge steps and contribute in that way. So that's a practical solution that the trade is also offering.
Right.
Yeah, but it also comes with a price sometimes, and yeah.
It's a heavy price for you to pay, is what you're saying.
Well, yes.
You want a level playing field, in a sense.
And in that respect, a level playing field, talking about the production standards, yes, let's go for the WTO, for the Codex Alimentarius platforms, and engage with our trading partners to raise the bar together.
Right. Thank you very much. John, there are a few questions, but if I could say we're coming towards the end of our session, so I'm going to turn to John now for answers to two questions that have come up, which I think are very important. But I'd like all the panelists to just give me 1 quick minute after John has spoken about the key priority going forward. We need to end in about 6 to 7 minutes. So John, the two questions that have come in for you, one is from Koen Mondelas, who's a colleague, obviously, and he says, should we go for more intensive or more extensive beef farming? This is to Angus and Peter, actually, excuse me, it's not to you, John. The one for you is about the WTO compatibility. If the EU does impose an environmental standard on third country imports or even a carbon adjustment tax, is it WTO compatible? The big question everyone's asking, by the way.
Well, I'm more comfortable talking about WTO than intensive versus extensive beef. The answer is that there is no yes or no answer. We have to look at every single measure on a case-by-case basis. Yes, one can, in some circumstances, impose on imports our own domestic production standards, in this case environmental, but there are some conditions attached. It will certainly help if the environmental standard is an internationally agreed one, in which there is a kind of global consensus. The environmental measure that one is trying to address needs to have a transboundary dimension, either global or at least transboundary. So, for example, the deforestation regulation has a very, very clear global objective, which is to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions produced through deforestation. So
that seems to have got some traction.
Absolutely. CBAM is the same. It's not a it's a way to try to ensure that the GHG emissions are reduced in the industrial sectors. So one can do this and be WTO compatible. In addition, one has to be transparent. One has to be non-discriminatory between countries where the same conditions apply. And the measure has to be proportionate to the objective being sought. So if you can meet those tests, and we have done successfully in the past, then yes, one can apply to imports domestic environmental production standards.
Okay, thank you, John, for that. So, Angus, let's get this one from you, the answer. Is it more intensive or more extensive beef farming, the option? Angus.
Yeah, I mean, if I was to speak entirely from an Irish perspective, the reality is most beef farming in Ireland is performed in an extensive manner, virtually all grass-based. A lot of the land where the beef animals are grazing is somewhat marginal land. It's not suitable for cropping. Parts of it would have heavy rainfall. So there's huge room for improvements in terms of what we're doing, and we have good programs in place around that in terms of our grassland management, our soil fertility, getting the correct pH. There's a whole range of good stuff that we're doing there, but that land that most of those cattle are grazing on, it's not arable type land, and what we're doing with it is we're making the best use out of it by converting grass into a protein which humans can eat in an area where there aren't too many options for it. So I would firmly be of the opinion that, you know, it's more of an extensive model that we're pursuing. But also, I think consumers, and from my time as chair of the Civil Dialogue grouping, certainly the feedback coming from quite a few of the sections on that grouping where they were looking for, you know, an extensive type model of farming. We don't have, in Europe, we don't have the use of the likes of
Angus, thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay,
I'm really,
yeah,
sorry to interrupt you, but I think your message has gone through very strong and clear. We're reaching the end, and I'm sorry, I have to say to the panelists, we're under a lot of time pressure today, so I won't have time to come back to all of you, but you've all made very strong, very, very powerful points about the role of trade in climate change mitigation. So I'd like to thank all the panelists. I'd like to thank Marcel and John, who've been here on stage with me, but also Judy, Angus, and Dr. Peter Havlik, who've joined online. Thank you very much indeed for your insights. And if I may say also to the participants who've joined us online, thank you very much for your engagement and your interaction and for your questions. From me, Shada Islam here in Brussels, goodbye, take care, and stay very safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks very much, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.